It was the most controversial American movie of its day. Even now, 100 years later, it remains as polarizing as ever. If pioneer filmmaker D.W. Griffith had ended his 3-hour Civil War epic Birth of a Nation at the halfway point, or about 100 minutes in following the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, this landmark but notorious 1915 movie in all likelihood would today be more revered rather than scorned. It was the first American feature film to run for 3 hours and cost in excess of $100,000. It was the first to be shown at admission prices of up to $2, normally charged for live performances. It was the first to have a specially conceived music score. It was the first movie to be shown to the President at the White House, the first to be shown to judges of the Supreme Court, and to members of Congress. It was the first movie to be distributed widely throughout the country as a roadshow attraction, to be seen by millions of Americans of all ages and walks of life. It was the first movie to have a powerful influence on the American cultural psyche. In short, Birth of a Nation changed the course of American cinema. Its impact, aesthetically and commercially, virtually created the American motion picture industry as we know it, fueling the imaginations and ambitions of hundreds upon hundreds of filmmakers to come. And it achieved all these firsts just 11 years after the birth of cinema itself. No other art form had grown up so quickly. That's probably how we would all be talking about Birth of a Nation today, if it had ended after 100 minutes. Yes, there would still be criticism of the first half's portrait of an antebellum South where slavery is shown as a benign economic system, where all plantation owners are benevolent, and all slaves are dutiful, productive, and above all, well-treated and happy. Margaret Mitchell's Civil War bestseller Gone with the Wind paints the same picture, and was criticized for it, as was the 1939 movie faithfully made from it. But neither has ever met with the outrage that has stuck to The Birth of a Nation for all its celluloid life. The reason why is that Griffith continued his story for another 90 minutes to show the impact of Reconstruction on the vanquished South. And it is this second half, with incidents drawn primarily from The Klansman and The Leopard's Spots, two popular novels by arch-segregationist Thomas W. Dixon, that caused all the uproar, and still does. Told entirely from the perspective of an embittered South that believed the war was caused by an abolitionist North determined to crush the white South under the heel of the black South, these incidents are incendiary. They include images of black insurrectionists attacking defeated but still proud Southern men, lusting after their women, and taking over the legislature, all at the behest of manipulative Northern carpetbaggers working behind the scenes. This results in the whites banding together to create a secret organization of sword-wielding, gun-toting vigilantes in robes to prevent their fellow citizens from further victimization, and to seek revenge on their victimizers. They call themselves Klansmen, with a capital C, not a K, but make no mistake, they are the Ku Klux Klan of more recent history. And the film concludes with their rousing ride to the rescue of a white family besieged by murderous blacks and mulattoes, an ugly depiction of racism at its paranoid worst. Griffith, a native Kentuckian who had lived most of his adult life in the North, always insisted he was not a racist and that his film was history, a portrait of the past. It's true that of the several hundred films he directed over his career, none of them before or after The Birth of a Nation exhibit similar racist elements. The irony is that Griffith also went on record saying he was inspired to make Birth of a Nation largely because of that dramatic scene of the Klansman's ride to the rescue Dixon had included in one of his books. I could see all those men in flowing white robes thundering across the landscape on horseback and thought, here was an opportunity to make the greatest, most stirring chase scene ever filmed. As a film pioneer, Griffith has been credited with everything from inventing the close-up to the dolly shot, none of which is true. His was the art of film editing, the juxtaposition of different images to propel story, illustrate thought, relate incidents and characters to one another, and create excitement. Even editing he did not invent, but he had been experimenting with it almost obsessively ever since 1908, when he directed his first one-reeler. The Birth of a Nation was, in many ways, his master's thesis on the craft. It brought a power and sophistication to film editing that had not been seen before in an American film or anywhere else. Griffith's statement at the time that his film should be viewed as history, a portrait of the past, is instructive. The feeling is that he was being sincere, not defensive of all the controversy. Throughout the film, he includes footnotes in the intertitles indicating the sources he drew upon for his depiction of certain historical events, costumes, military customs, and so on. The inflammatory incidents in the second half of the film come from Dixon's novels, which Dixon also claimed were drawn from the historical record. The question is, whose historical record? Dixon, the son of a farmer, was born in North Carolina in 1864. Griffith, also the son of a farmer, was born in Kentucky in 1875, 10 years after the war and Reconstruction had ended. Neither man had first-hand experience of either the war, its causes, or its aftermath. By the time either Dixon or Griffith were old enough to become aware of the conflict, it had receded in the memories even of many who'd lived through it. So Griffith, Dixon, and others of their generation got their history from tales passed down by their elders. In the case of Griffith, who received no formal education beyond early grade school, the past came down to him primarily from the mouth of his father, a former Confederate colonel turned alcoholic wastrel nicknamed Roaring Jake Griffith. Almost as soon as the war ended, Southern aristocrats, politicians, novelists, and veterans groups began mythologizing the conflict as a war of aggression that had been visited on the genteel way of life of a victimized South. The Griffith-Dixon generation bought into this myth of a preyed-upon South and its noble lost cause, that cause being not the preservation and expansion of a slave economy for the benefit of the plantation class, but something called states' rights. This was defined by the mythmakers as the right of any state to secede from the Union without recrimination for the sake of freedom. Dixon's novels reinforce this myth, as does Griffith's The Birth of a Nation. So does Margaret Mitchell's novel Gone with the Wind, and the film David O. Selznick made from it. Many other Civil War novels and films made right up to today convey the same message. Others skirt the myths entirely by focusing instead on the hardships faced and the courage shown by the fighting men of both sides. Stephen Crane's famous novel, The Red Badge of Courage, is an example, as is the film John Huston made from it. As a result of these myths, which are still widely accepted, particularly in many rural areas of the South, it has been said that while the North may have won the Civil War by preserving the Union, the South won the peace with its lost cause propaganda. The Birth of a Nation did not originate this propaganda, but as the biggest, most expensive American movie up to that time, and a blockbuster, Griffith's film contributed to disseminating it to an audience wider than ever thought possible. The Birth of a Nation set the pattern. After all, books and movies are costly to produce. So if your subject is the Civil War and you hope for a bestseller or a blockbuster, it may not be smart to alienate half your potential audience by questioning its beliefs. Perhaps the most serious charge leveled at The Birth of a Nation by history is the role it played in the revival of the Ku Klux Klan. This terrorist group had effectively been stamped out in the 1870s, but the second decade of the new 20th century saw the Klan's rebirth in ever greater numbers. The role Griffith's film played in all this is mixed. It was, in Griffith's view, a movie about the past and not the present. It did not call for such a revival. Griffith even denounced this newer, more vicious version of the Klan. It was that, all right, an equal opportunity hate group that targeted not just blacks, but Catholics, Jews, and anyone else who posed a threat to white Anglo-Saxon supremacy. In fact, this new Klan came into being 2 years before the release of Griffith's film, with the 1913 lynching in Georgia of the Jewish northerner Leo Frank. Frank, the manager of an Atlanta pencil-making company, had been convicted of the sex murder of one of his employees, 13-year-old Mary Fagan, on the flimsiest of evidence. On that basis, the state's governor commuted Frank's sentence to life. En route to the prison farm where he was to be confined, Frank was pulled from his train by a group of vigilantes calling themselves the Knights of Mary Fagan, and hanged from a nearby tree. The group later burned a huge cross that could be seen for miles. Frank, who was innocent, has since been given a posthumous pardon by the state of Georgia. But with his murder, the new Klan was born, and its anti-miscegenation message was clear: keep your mongrel hands off our women. So what part did The Birth of a Nation play in the Klan's revival? Certainly its glorification of the Klan as avenging angels at the exciting conclusion was the biggest element, because these images were used by the Klan for propaganda purposes as a recruitment tool. The film's advertising logo of a rearing horse and sword-wielding rider cloaked in a white robe was hijacked by the Reborn Klan and incorporated into its recruitment posters and flyers for decades to come. As The Birth of a Nation came out in 1915, most rural areas throughout the South where the Klan flourished did not have picture palaces. Screenings in these areas were held mostly in storefronts, revival tents, and churches where 16mm prints were projected on a wall or a sheet. The Birth's producer, Roy Aitken, had a slew of 16mm prints made up just for these rural markets. Not surprisingly, a print or two may have disappeared in transit from one town to another and turned up later at Klan rallies to stir followers and new recruits. This early example of film piracy firmly illustrates the law of unintended consequences. All evidence indicates that Griffith's stated goal was not to fan the flames of racial hatred anew and revive the Klan, but to present what he believed to be a truthful and exciting historical melodrama. But as one contemporary Klan member was later quoted as saying, "The birth of a nation helped us tremendously." D.W. Griffith's next and greater film is frequently described by film historians as the director's apology for the unintended consequences caused by the birth of a nation. But as Intolerance was already in production before The Birth was released, that was clearly not the case. Griffith objected to the cries for censorship of his film, but he never apologized for the content that had stirred those cries. That's because he never swayed from his distinctly Southern view of the film as history. However, much later in his life, he did make this very telling statement. In the wake of the success of Gone with the Wind, he was asked if he had any plans to remake or re-release The Birth of a Nation for a new generation of filmgoers. Reflecting the controversy in our own time over the removal of artifacts like the Confederate battle flag from public buildings in the South, Griffith said of his film, "It belongs in a museum. That's where it should be seen."